kind of like a donut effect, though. There's like areas and like a block away from the SkyTrain that are meant to be like 40-story tower that is just an empty field still. It's kind of fascinating. It's like they're densifying without adding any high rise.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if like could the city change that by allowing higher height restriction? Like if the developer could get a few extra floors, then they could make enough money to buy the land and develop property.
I think it's just that the price that you can sell a unit at just doesn't allow for significant high rise development. And there was a lot of failed ones, so I think a lot of people are gun shy of it right now, especially in 2008 when they lived there on buildings on fire.
Actually?
Yeah.
Like high rise?
That was under construction. It was fraudulently lit on fire by the developer to try to cash in on insurance because the market had crashed and they were going to go bankrupt if they didn't.
Yeah, that textbook case of fraud.
That's it's usually frowned upon.
Oh man, that's brutal. Hello listeners, and first off let me say I am sorry for having this episode out so late. A combination of health and technical issues, some technical issues that were multifarious and severe, have delayed the release of this podcast. As it turns out, they are not entirely fixable, so when an area of particularly bad static comes on, if you find it totally unbearable, just skip ahead about 4 minutes and it will kind of subside. We will work on the microphone issues and have this fixed for the next episode. That said, everything else is actually relatively topical, except for one thing, and we will include a breaking news alert for that particular news item. With that, on with the show.
Hello and welcome to Pod Keep Our Land. It's what?
Ernie Coombs, Mr. Dressup.
What if listened to? We are a show about Canadian politics, parliaments, politicians, and policy. My name is Erin Rennie.
And I'm Patrick Meehan.
And I'm Matthew Naylor.
It's November 30th, 2017, and we are podcasting to you from Vancouver, BC. Okay, so today we've got a great show for you. We're going to be starting off with the federal by-election. We're going to be talking about the National Day of Remembrance. We are going to do an update on the BC Liberal race. We'll be talking about some of the federal apologies that have come out of the Prime Minister's office lately. We'll be talking about the Child Poverty Report, the National Housing Strategy, and we'll end on Canada's biggest TV thing. So let's start with what happened in Parliament today. Patrick, can you give us an update?
Yeah, so this morning in Parliament, heckling was happening at Minister Morneau, as seems to be wont to happen. And Speaker Regan stood up to try to call for order in the House, which usually when the Speaker asks for order in the House, you're supposed to be silent and let the Speaker carry on. So the Speaker interrupts Minister Morneau, says, everybody calm down, let's let Minister Morneau answer the question. Not everybody calmed down. One MP continued to heckle and shout, and so Speaker Regan gave him the opportunity to decide whether or not to take a break or to be taken out of the Parliament. And again, there was a harumphing coming from opposition benches, and so Speaker Regan then turned and said to the member, he said, would the member from Banff Airdrie please step out of the chamber or be forced to step out of the chamber? And again, he didn't change, and so he says, I name you, Mr. Richards, would the Sergeant at Arms please escort Mr. Richards out of the chamber, which is epic in terms of parliamentary stuff, because you're not supposed to name members at all. You're not supposed to give anybody by their name, and the Speaker generally doesn't throw people out of the legislature very often. The last time it was done was in 2002 by, if I recall correctly, it was Chuck Strahl. Prior to that was Sven Robinson in the mid-90s, and then another one of Sven Robinson again in the mid-80s. It's not an event that happens often.
It's something that happens for persistent bad behavior without apologizing. The House will forgive quite a bit of stuff from its members. Keith Martin once jumped over his desk and grabbed the mace and swung it around the House of Commons, which is a no-no in terms of parliamentary procedure.
Forgot about that one.
And he very contritely apologized, and so he wasn't named and forced out of the House.
Why is it so bad to be named? What's the naming thing about?
You're supposed to not personalize the debate, and so you're supposed to put everything through the Speaker. It's not supposed to be, Trudeau against Andrew Scheer. It's supposed to be Trudeau and Andrew Scheer having a debate in the legislature legislature without personalizing each other. And so the idea is you de-escalate some of the conflict by having people not name each other or nickname each other. In the BC context, as we talked about last episode, is the idea is it's supposed to de-escalate. I don't know how effective that is, but I do find that if you're arguing with somebody, if you use their name a lot, or you say you and you point at them, you're going to get a lot more, emotional about it.
So being named in the House is shameful.
If a member names another member, the member that actually does the naming has to leave. The only person that has
both of them actually
both
have
of
to
them,
leave.
yeah. The only person that has the right to do it is the speaker, and when he names somebody, it's because he's kicking them out.
Yeah, it's the most severe level of punishment that can happen on a day-to-day basis.
Well, you can put them in the cells.
That's true.
But that one hasn't been done since like the 1800s. Fun fact, there are cells in the BC legislature as well as the Parliament in Ottawa.
You mentioned something about not saying you, and by way of explanation, the comments in the House have to be addressed through the chair or through the speaker. So even in question period, the questions are addressed to the speaker. So it'll be, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of the Environment tell the House da-da-da-da-da, rather than Minister of Environment, will you?
Right.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. It hasn't happened in 15 years. It was all the buzz of Twitter today, and it's a minor parliamentary thing, but I think it's interesting that it comes on the heels of BC taking the BC Speaker's decision to not allow nicknames in the House and things like that. And maybe we are looking at legislatures starting to act like adults.
Maybe. Or maybe not. It sounds like this is all coming out of the finance minister, Bill Morneau, and to do with his personal finances. And it sounds like that's causing all sorts of consternation and noise.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going away. I think it's safe for us to say we'll talk about it next time. Anyway, we should move on. Just a quick note, I did want to remind everyone that December 6th is the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women in Canada. And this is a pretty somber day. It's to mark the anniversary of the murders of 14 young women studying at École Polytechnique in Montreal in 1989. And these women were gunned down by a shooter because they were women studying engineering. And it's a really important reminder of the violence that many women in Canada face every single day, and that we need to continue to commit to action and remembrance and standing up against this kind of gender-based violence.
Are there ceremonies or events that people can go to?
Yes, there are. Yeah, there are events taking place all over the country, and you can have a moment of silence at your workplace or in your school. It's a pretty important thing to do, I think. I think gender-based violence isn't always discussed. It's a pretty difficult thing to talk about. So this is an opportunity to raise that subject.
Yeah, there will be ceremonies on pretty much every university and college campus in Canada as well, just because it did occur at a university campus, and that sort of is nearer and closer to the hearts with people that work in those environments.
I think the engineers do the ceremony at UBC, don't they?
Yeah, because it was an engineering school in Quebec. Yeah.
So let's move on then. I want to talk about the federal by-election. That's happening just in a few days on December 11th. There are, I believe, 4 seats up for grabs right now across the country, and one of the most contentious ones is actually right here in British Columbia, Surrey White Rock, which was formerly Diane Watts' seat, and Diane Watts, of course, is running for BC Liberal leadership, so she's given up her seat, and there's quite a few people who are vying for that seat. If you are a right-of-center voter in Surrey White Rock, and chances are you are, you have your choice of right-of-center parties to vote for everything from the Conservative Party of Canada to the Christian Heritage Party of Canada and the Libertarian Party of Canada, and what were some of the other ones?
The Progressive Canadian Party, which is attempting to carry on the lifespan of the Red Tories, the Progressive Conservatives. And yes, I think that more or less sums it up.
And the Liberals.
Oh, and the Liberals.
Right.
who are being represented by a man who I thought would have run for the Conservatives, personally.
The man who is running is Gordie Hogue. He was the former MLA for basically the same area.
And prior to that, he was the mayor of White Rock.
Oh.
I believe he was a 2-term mayor of White Rock before becoming an MLA for White Rock, and so he's been elected in White Rock for, well, most of the time I've been alive, I think.
So the Liberals are really pushing for the seat. It would be a pickup for them because Diane Watts was running as a Conservative in the last election. And yeah, it's interesting. You're right. I think a lot of people would have expected Gordie Hogue to be a Conservative candidate. But did you know anything about him. Like, he's certainly a smart guy.
Yep, he's a very smart guy.
Yeah, he was a cabinet minister in the Gordon Campbell days in British Columbia, and very popular in White Rock, Surrey. So it is interesting that he's more on the Liberal side of the BC Liberal coalition, and so he's probably one of the big names, very likely to take that seat. But he's up against Carrie Lee Finlay for the Conservative Party, who also was, I believe, a federal cabinet minister, really big name, very popular. So that's going to be a really interesting race to watch. And if other by-elections are an indicator of what we can expect here, by-elections are often sort of a check-in on how people feel about the federal government. So it will really let us know how the average voter is thinking about the Trudeau Liberals.
Voters will often use by-elections to send a message to the governing party if they feel that the government is on the wrong track. So like in BC, over the past 30 years, there's been one victory by an MLA, or two victories, Christy Clark and I think Mike DeYoung, for a by-election when their party was in power.
Yeah, it's extremely rare. Federally, it's a little bit more possible given the way that federal politics works, but yeah, it is interesting to see. The other thing I would like to talk about, if we could, is Battleford's Lloydminster, which is another one of the by-elections, mostly because the candidates are amazing. Rodeo cowboy and rancher Ken Finlayson did not win the Conservative nomination, so he's running as an independent instead. And professional mixed martial arts fighter and athlete Matt Fedler is running for the New Democratic Party, making for possibly the greatest by-election debates anyone could possibly go to.
I really hope they televise those debates. Are they the only two candidates? Or?
No, there is a former political staffer running for the Conservatives as well. The Liberal candidate is a contractor and former city councillor, was acclaimed as the Liberal candidate, making them the most boring person amongst the list.
And where are the other two by-elections taking place?
The other two by-elections, one of them is out in the Maritimes. That's Judy Foote's riding. She was a fairly high-profile cabinet minister in the Liberal government, but she had to resign due to, I think, some fairly severe family emergency that was going on. She stepped down, and so she's being replaced almost for sure by a Liberal. And then there's also which one am I looking at here? Scarborough-Agincourt, which is a long-held Liberal seat in the Greater Toronto area, which is also expected to stay Liberal. So of the four ridings, two of them were held by Liberals, two of them held by Conservatives. It's expected that two will stay Liberal, one will stay Conservative, and one is a bit of a toss-up between, which is South Surrey White Rock, between Gordon Hogue and Carrie Lynn Finlay.
So, as a fun fact, the riding of Battleford's Lloydminster is the same size as the nation of Armenia.
That is a fun fact.
Mm-hmm.
Canada's really big. I believe there's a song about that.
Yes.
So 4 seats up for by-election. This would have been an opportunity for Jagmeet Singh, new leader of the NDP, to get a seat in the House, and he decided not to run. Just interesting. Do you think there's anything to that?
I think in this situation, they've said their strategy is to leave him out of the House. But I think that if there was a riding that came up that looked like it could be one that he could win fairly well, I think they might take it. But in this case, there was never a real strategic question of whether he should run. None of these ridings have any chance of electing a new Democrat, and so why risk losing face?
Yeah, fair.
It's not like he's not in the news.
Yeah,
he's been doing a really good job of like putting his face out there and introducing himself.
So that is the advantage of not being a parliamentarian, is you don't have to sit in the House being boring all the time. You can actually go out and do stuff.
Right. Interesting. So the other race that we're watching right now is the BC Liberal leadership race to replace Christy Clark. Matthew, can you give us a bit of an update on how that race is going?
Sure. So most of the candidates, presumably have declared. There is a little bit more time for candidates to jump into the race, though at this point it would be pretty unlikely for them to do so. The 29th of December is the nomination deadline, and the deadline to become a member of the party to be eligible to vote. So if you're interested in the future of center-right politics in British Columbia, and you want your say as to who's going to lead the party into the next election, join the BC Liberal Party before December 29th. If you join after, you won't be able to vote in the leadership election.
You can join online.
You can join online at the BC Liberal Party website.
Credit card, say it's like $10 membership or something?
Yeah. Credit card or manila envelope passed to a party organizer in a smoke-filled back room.
Yes.
Honestly, I really double down on the idea that joining a political party to vote in a leadership race is one of the more powerful things you can do in democracy, and I really support it.
There's not a lot of smoke-filled back rooms anymore.
No.
Not many smokers.
Right, yeah.
There are still back rooms.
But with cannabis legislation, maybe there'll be more smoke-filled back rooms.
But yeah, so how do you think the race is shaping?
Sorry.
I just moved on. So how do you think the race is shaping up, though?
I think it's been all right. I've been very disappointed as someone who is interested in at least exploring the idea of electoral reform that all the candidates seem to have assumed that the party's just against it and don't seem to be talking about like the merits of the idea, but rather how a grassroots movement larger than any we have ever seen must be mobilized to stop the electoral reform referendum, which like is unconvincing, and it's kind of disappointing that so much air is being spent on it. Right now, it looks like Andrew Wilkinson and Todd Stone have emerged as the two front runners in the campaign. Both of them are kind of liberal-ish from the liberal side of the party. In terms of other candidates, Diane Watts is not doing super great.
Yeah, she seems to still have she seems to still really have sort of the name recognition, but it sounds like her campaign isn't going all that well. And honestly, like having grown up in Surrey, gone through politics in Surrey, I'm not at all surprised that she's not a good speaker. And she's not very knowledgeable about political issues. She was very successful in what is very low quality of competition in Surrey as a municipal politician, and that could be a hard translation into the provincial realm.
Yeah, that has come up at debates where Andrew Wilkinson in particular has challenged her on policy specifics, and she wasn't particularly able to deliver what her idea or plan was going to be. So there is another debate this weekend in Kelowna. I'm going to be watching it. I think I'm going to be making my final choice by then. And then February 1st is when voting begins. On the 3rd, 2 days later, voting will end and the results will be announced.
It's quick.
What do you think are going to be the big issues, the deal-breaking issues for folks?
I think the big one is how do we keep the party together, because that's top of mind for the BC Liberals all the time. The coalition of federal Liberals and federal Conservatives is tenuous at best and nearly fell apart a couple of years ago. So the leader will have to do that. And also, how do we regain the trust of British Columbians, particularly people who voted Green? Basically, this is what the party seems to have groupthink its way to, is that people who voted Green, who had previously voted Liberal, those were the things that cost the BC Liberals the election.
I think there's some validity to that. I think that there are ridings that certainly the NDP nearly won because of a growing Green vote that came at the expense of the Liberals. Even the riding that we're sitting in right now, which is Vancouver Falls Creek, very nearly was an NDP win.
Oh, yeah.
Almost solely on the back of a very strong candidate for the NDP, I should say, but also on the back of a rising Green vote that ate away at the Lib vote. But how do you think Michael Lee is doing? I've heard some thought that he might be a dark horse.
Michael Lee is probably the candidate in the back of the pack that could emerge as a compromise candidate if animosity grows between the Stone and Wilkinson camps and neither of them see themselves as being able to support the other candidate. Then they might compromise on a guy like Michael Lee, who is a conservative and a lawyer from downtown Vancouver.
Well-spoken guy, too.
Relatively well-spoken. He hasn't performed as well as Stone or Wilkinson in the debates. At least, that's my own judgment. But
Wilkinson was born to debate, as far as I can tell.
He is a punchy guy.
Are any of them emerging as like a clear Green Liberal candidate?
I haven't heard much environmental messaging coming from any of the leaders.
Yeah, like if that's what they think they're going to win on.
Yeah, like Todd Stone in particular has talked about the need to win back those voters and regain BC's position of climate leadership. That's usually the rhetoric that it gets couched in, regain BC's position as a climate leader, because
legitimately there was about a 2-year window that BC was.
And the BC Liberals of the time should be rightly proud of that, if only they had kept on with it.
Okay, so December 29th is what you said?
December 29th is the deadline to sign up new members for people to get into the race. So if you want to vote for BC Liberal Leader or want to be BC Liberal Leader, scrape together your $50,000 entry fee and submit it to...
Check your couches.
Yeah.
Small price to pay, really.
Yeah, there's probably $50,000 like down the back of Kyle Washington's yacht up in North Van, or Jimmy Pattison's coin drawer has a BC Liberal entrance fee in it, but
probably does.
So
he could run as chief of staff.
Anyway, join the party if you are interested, and if you want to help out your candidate, help sign up more members to the party before the 29th.
Okay, thank you very much. Back to Ottawa now. The Prime Minister in the last couple of weeks has delivered 2 major apologies. The first one was an apology to residential school survivors from Newfoundland and Labrador. And the reason that these students or these survivors did not receive the apology and the settlement funding from the apology that Prime Minister Stephen Harper gave several years ago was because those schools were not operated by the Canadian government, and they started before Newfoundland and Labrador joined the Confederation, and so they were excluded from that earlier residential school apology. So what the apology is for was the fact that between 1949 and 1979, thousands of Indigenous children were taken away from their communities to attend 5 residential schools that were run by the International Grenfell Association or Moravians, where many of them were sexually and physically abused and suffered language and cultural losses similar to the other residential school survivors. So that was a pretty important apology for that community, and many of the children or many of the survivors there are Innu nation, and they actually have decided not to participate in the apology process because there were actually lots of other abuses that are still not included in this apology. So that's a really interesting problem where when you issue these national apologies and then you inadvertently exclude certain groups. The other major apology that happened this week was an apology to the LGBTQ community, public servants and military members who were purged from government jobs and military positions during the Cold War. And also a really saddening story to hear. I don't know about you guys, but I didn't know about this story, but between 1950s and the 1990s, thousands of federal workers were investigated, punished, and fired from their military and civil service because of their sexuality. And government justified the purge on national security grounds, with homosexuality viewed as a, quote, character weakness, leaving people open to blackmail by foreign governments. So this was over 40 years that this was taking place. I had never heard about this or learned about this in school.
I learned about it, though. I think this is probably because I have a little greater interest in, LGBT history in Canada, but I definitely knew that we had a machine that was supposed to figure out who was gay by, monitoring the blood and blood flow and dilation of parts of the body. It was an emotional thing listening to both these apologies. To be honest, I couldn't say which one more so because I had not really been affected by the LGBT apology, but when the Prime Minister was standing up in the House and saying, this is a country that acknowledges that it has done bad things and that you are accepted and you are part of the Canadian polity, I choked up a little bit because, it means more than the strict statement of apology, in my opinion. Like, the federal government is apologizing for what past federal governments have done, but I think it is an interesting way to try and define, national ideas, is to say, look back into our past, these are the things that are not up to our moral standards today, and then apologize for them and try and keep that in mind as we build a nation for the future.
Yeah, I listened to the House podcast, the CBC's The House podcast, pretty religiously, and Chris Hall was in Newfoundland for the apology, and he was reporting on it. And, reporters are dispassionate even when they're reporting on school shootings or anything that's awful and horrific. They're oftentimes very dispassionate because they've been trained to give that voice. And Chris Hall even choked up when he was reporting some of the stories that he'd heard throughout the process of this remembrance and this truth and reconciliation moment. And he even choked up and apologized for it and said, I'm sorry, but it's been very emotional hearing all these stories from people that lived these lives. And I think that that's really valuable to our society to really have a moment to say, hey, we did this and we apologize for it. And hopefully we think about what we did and we think about what, we as a society were capable of doing and probably still are capable of doing. And hopefully we prevent it from happening again.
Really important for awareness raising.
Yeah.
I think it reminds us, I think there's this tendency in Canada to think like, oh, we're so great.
We're not the United States.
Yeah, right. And get comfortable with that idea. And it's so important to remember that, like in the happy 1950s of Leave It to Beaver and Lassie, like not everybody was living a wonderful white suburban lifestyle.
In the 80s and the 90s.
And,
a lot of these things were still happening while we were alive.
Yes.
It also helps us remind ourselves that 20, 50, 70 years down the road, there are things that we are doing today that will not meet the moral standards of the people of the time.
Absolutely.
And I think that's really worth considering. Like, are we being the best people that we can be?
Well, I think with the boil water advisories on Indigenous communities and the percentage of homeless that are Indigenous in our downtown cores, I think it's really clear that we're not being the people that we can and should be. And so while we're apologizing, we still got a lot to go.
It's very humbling, and I hope it's a reminder to decision makers, politicians, public servants, etc., that while they probably have great ideas, they're going to hurt people, and to bear that in mind. That in 20 years we may be apologizing for something that was a necessary compromise today, or was thought to be.
I do want to say too that every party leader in Ottawa supported the apologies publicly, which is not something that's always happened before, which is a sign, I think, that we as a people are becoming better, is that we didn't have, and to name it, it's always been the Conservative Party leader has traditionally opposed these apologies on a number of grounds, some of which are principled, some of which are not. But I think it's telling to see that we're moving forward as a people, that all of our major mainstream political parties are in support of this.
Although credit where credit is due, it was Harper who did deliver the apology in 2008.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there is...
and Mulroney apologized for internment of Japanese Canadians in World War II and so on.
Something Canada or something British Columbia didn't get around to doing for another 25 years.
Yes.
I just wanted to point out, not all of the members were in the House during the apology to the LGBTQ2 community, and some of the more socially conservative members were notably absent for that, and that is also an important reminder that there's still vocal and active resistance to some of the anti-oppression work that we're trying to do in our schools and communities.
Yeah, I came across an article that was heavily quoting Jason Kenney from the marriage debates in the mid-2000s. And Jason Kenney is now the leader of the Conservative Party in Alberta, potentially the next premier of Alberta. And he said, and he was very clear in this article, and this is 12 years ago, not even, he said, gays and lesbians are free to get married if they want to, as long as they marry somebody of the opposite sex. And this is somebody who's still in politics today who said that less than a dozen years ago. And I think you're right, it is really important that we sort of remember that these people are still part of a mainstream political movement.
I mean, Jason Kenney is very busy trying to make it so that teachers can out their gay students to parents.
To their parents? Yeah.
It's,
so I think that you're absolutely right, Matthew, is that you're right, is that these apologies are important, but it's also important as part of the apology to think about what we're doing today that we shouldn't be.
Did you have anything you wanted to add on
No,
this?
it's totally gone.
Sure?
It was good too.
Because you were going to talk about the nature of apologies and why we as a society apologize, and I think you touched on it, but I don't know if that was what you were aiming for.
Yeah, I touched on it a little bit. So I wanted to talk, since we are talking about two apologies today, why we apologize as a nation. Like, there have been a number of them in recent memory, both at the provincial and the federal level, on the apology to Japanese Canadians you brought up, and that was one that I was very proud to be involved in some small way with.
Well, and Pierre Trudeau staunchly opposed the idea of apologizing, for example.
Yeah, and I just think it's a very Canadian way to go about trying to solve our problems. It's to say, we're sorry. Obviously nothing is going to be able to completely give back the years of your life or your property or your dignity that has been robbed of you. But at least now there is an acknowledgement that that was wrong, that it shouldn't have happened in the first place, and that those indignities that you were subjected to, they should be lifted. And there's a very specific point in the LGBTQ apology where you can go and apply to have a criminal record for homosexual sex expunged, not pardoned, but completely wiped out from federal records.
And there's also money set aside. There's $110 million set aside for people who lost their jobs to recompense them for the loss of their jobs, right? If you had somebody that, was 2 years shy of being able to collect their pension after, some number of years of service, well, that really negatively harmed them, and that we now have money set aside to help them. And the other thing that I thought was really fascinating about this fund is if it doesn't get fully used, if not the full amount of it gets used for recompensing people for their loss, it's mandated to stay within the queer community of Canada, going into things like support for gay youth and things like that. And that's really, I think, really powerful itself.
Do you think apologies can play a role in building trust in government and a sense of accountability with your government and improve citizen engagement with government?
Well, citizen engagement might have been the goal of the Quick Wins scandal that might be
Right.
the dark side of apologies, where it's being done in a more crass political way than to actually make a heartfelt heartfelt statement of remorse on the part of the government. But I think that it is a really good way of demonstrating to people, to communities, that that which was done in the past shouldn't be done in the future, and it does rebuild those bonds of trust that would have been shattered by that first initial betrayal.
Yeah, I think I've seen that reflected in a lot of the interviews that have happened with people from the communities for which the apologies have been issued, both of these ones here and in previous times. I've definitely seen the people that spoke up saying that they felt like finally the government was listening to them, and that finally the government was acknowledging what had been done to them, and that meant a huge amount. See people really break down in tears over it, and I think that must have a huge impact on the communities involved.
You want to pause it? So we were just reflecting on the fact that we were focusing really heavily on some pretty heavy social issues in this episode, but they're important, so I'm glad we're talking about them. So our next topic, Child Poverty Report Card. This was released this week by First Call, the BC Child and Youth Advocacy Coalition. And this is an anti-poverty campaign that has basically been trying to raise awareness of the fact that government made a promise in 1989 to end child poverty by the year 2000. And that has not happened. That has not happened. For the last, I don't know how many years, 10 years plus, BC has had the highest child poverty rate in the country. And we're not number one anymore. BC's
Hooray!
Child poverty rate has actually gone down slightly from, so what they do in the report card is they use tax filer data from 2 years prior. So they're using data from 2015 for the 2017 report. And so there's a slight drop. In 2014, it was 19.8% of children were living in poverty in British Columbia, and in 2015, it went down to 18.3%. That is still too high. I think we can all agree.
1 in 5.
That's 1 in 5.
That's stark.
Yeah, and we are one of the have provinces. We're one of the wealthier provinces, and we still have lots of little kids growing up in poverty, and of course those rates are even higher for certain groups of children. So 50% of children 50% of children growing up in single-parent households, for example, are living in poverty. About 1/3 of Indigenous children living off reserve are living in poverty. So this is really important. First Call has also recommended some means for decreasing child poverty, which include raising the minimum wage, extending the provincial child benefit, and they've also are advocating for free transit for children, which would be a really interesting way of relieving some costs for kids.
They can't ride the bus alone, apparently.
Well, but it's also that's a huge family issue. Is if you live out in Surrey and you want to take your 2 or 3 kids to Science World, for example, you're not just paying fare for yourself. You're paying fare for all 3 of your kids if they're over the age of whatever the cutoff is, the 4 or 5. That adds up really fast. $275 per kid. So you're looking at $550 for your 2 kids plus yourself. That's another $275. And then round trip that. So you're looking at it's nearly $20 just to get your kids to Science World. Then you got to pay to get into Science World. So it's in order to if you are coming from a low income background, you're probably living far away from a lot of amenities. In order to get your kids to things so that they can have experiences that kids should have growing up, I mean, free transit is just a no brainer to me.
So for a couple statistics, the rate this year was 18.3%, and that's 153,300 children in British Columbia living under the poverty line, and it's a full percentage point higher than the national average of 17.4%.
Do you have what provinces do well on this? I assume Quebec is on the list of do well. I assume Alberta probably does well just because they're floating on oil.
I do. So British Columbia is about at the middle of the pack. The worst jurisdiction in Canada for child poverty is Nunavut, where 36.1% of kids are living in child poverty. The current best is actually the Yukon Territory, where 12.5 are living in child poverty.
And among the provinces?
Among the provinces, the best 2 are Alberta and Quebec.
Stands to reason. One's very affluent, one has a strong social safety net.
Mm-hmm. And then Manitoba and Saskatchewan, the 2 other prairie provinces, are the worst for child poverty at respectively 27 and 24%.
Low economies for a long time will hurt them.
So we've been working on this since 1989. Presumably people were working on this prior to that. Why no action? Why have we failed to end child poverty in this country?
Well, for a couple of reasons. One, it is very difficult difficult to get the federal and provincial governments to work together on anything, and this is no exception. Also, the BC Liberals have rather steadfastly refused for quite a period of time to actually create a plan to reduce child poverty. They just and this is their philosophy of government, wanted to create a better jobs environment so that people could be lifted out of poverty. And there is some evidence to suggest that they were at least partially able to do that. From when they took power in 2001, the child poverty rate has dropped from 24 to 18%.
But notably, every other province also drops as well.
Yes.
I think too that, and I don't want to just bash a political party for this, but I think we as a society became a bunch of poor bashers throughout the late 80s, early 90s, 2000s, and so we got this opinion that welfare was a four-letter word and you shouldn't be on it, and we should freeze the welfare rolls. And BC did that, but other provinces did too, and that directly increases the number of kids in poverty, right? And so when we as a society say we can't afford a social safety net, we have to acknowledge that that's going to hit children,
and that compounds and creates all sorts of other social problems that are very expensive to deal with.
Long-term expenses that
opioids
become
crisis.
Yeah, and then we get a short-term reduction in cost by not supporting children, and then we have to pay for the cost of that mistake.
Interesting change of approach at the provincial level. There is now Minister of Poverty Reduction, I believe, Shane Simpson, and so they're working on a poverty strategy, and we can look forward to seeing what's going to be in that early in 2018. Another hopeful thing was that they raised the income assistance rates by $100, and that was the first time income assistance had been raised in over 10 years. So that will help a little bit, but still a lot of work to be done on this front.
What, just for everyone's information, what is poverty exactly?
Well, there's two metrics for poverty that we use, and I'm not sure what was used for the number. There's sort of absolute poverty, which is being below us, having an income below a certain threshold to be able to afford a reasonable basket of goods, which goes all the way back to Adam Smith, who talked about the idea that people should be able to purchase, like our society should have, everyone in our society should be able to purchase a reasonable basket of goods. And then there's the relative poverty, which is a analysis of being on the low end of the spectrum. So that was numbers that I was pulling up earlier when we were talking about this, that were coming from a low income background. That would oftentimes be considered a relative poverty, because you're in relative poverty compared to the rest of society. And so there's a lot of criticisms of using relative poverty, but I think there's also some validity to it, is that if everyone's driving around in a Tesla and you're driving your 1986 Tercel, it's pretty shitty for you.
Yeah, I believe this report uses Stats Canada's low income cutoff, the LICO, which is the the relative measure.
And then the other option is the market basket measure, or MBM, which is not the first all standard.
No.
Right.
Well, because just because you can get by with shelter and clothing and food doesn't necessarily mean you're not impoverished in our society.
And historically, the societies that are the most equal are basically the most happy.
And the most economically prosperous.
So the LICO measures in BC, I think, are somewhat skewed by the very high incomes of a few people, or some communities.
The Washington and Paterson issue again.
the West Vancouver and Oak Bay issue, you could also call it, I think.
Well, it's not an issue, but it just if you're going to measure poverty on a relative scale, you have higher inequality if you have some people who are making a lot of So shall we move on to our next topic?
Absolutely.
You're ready?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm definitely ready.
All right. Okay. On a hopeful note, the federal government recently announced a huge new program. The National Housing Strategy is going to be the equivalent of $40 billion. It's a 10-year strategy. Partnerships with the provincial government. They're aiming to build 100,000 new units, repair 300,000 units, and cut homelessness by 50%. This is huge, except it doesn't kick in until after the next federal election, which is at least 2 years away.
I'm sure that there's no coincidence with that timing.
None whatsoever.
It is a good plan. I don't want to bash the plan. I think it's the federal government doing what it can with a lot of the levers that it can, and it's also the federal government getting back to the housing table for the first time since the 95 budget. They spent 22 years not at the housing table, and so getting the federal government in, I think, is nominal good.
Right. So a lot of this strategy is dollars. It's dollars to build new housing. It's matching funds for the provinces if the provinces are able to come up with their their own dollars to build new or repair affordable housing. And then there's also a benefit that will go directly to renters to help them get into a house.
So who's eligible for that?
So this is the really neat one, is that this has not been done before, and I think it's interesting, is if you've applied to get into social housing and you're approved, you oftentimes are on a wait list for sometimes multiple years because there's not a lot of social housing available. And so what the federal government's going to do is they're going to take some of the money they've earmarked for the housing strategy and they're going to give it directly to the individuals that are on these wait lists. So if you think about it, if you're housed and you're spending 60 or 70% of your income on housing because you're a significantly low income impoverished person and you're on the wait list for social housing where you're going to be able to pay $300 a month for your housing or less, you're still having to pay for your housing. And if you should lose that housing, you're on the street and you're going to cost the system significantly more, and also it sucks. And so what the federal government's going to do is they're going to give you money, which is, I think, going to help a lot of people stay housed. The Vancouver Rent Bank, for example, has had a lot of success helping people out in that same manner.
This is interesting from a constitutional perspective because it's not all that often that the federal government will give transfers directly from itself to individuals.
A person.
Yeah. The only other thing that I can think of off the top of my head is the Canadian Millennium Scholarship Foundation, which
no longer exists.
Which no longer exists. God rest its soul. But it was operating in an area of provincial jurisdiction, education and universities, and was basically skipping the provincial government. It wasn't giving them as grants to the provinces to spend. It was giving the scholarships to the individuals. And
social housing takes a long time to build. We don't have a whole lot of social housing units, and if you didn't give that money to those individuals, a lot of them are going to end up homeless, and that's awful. Or, and we talked about it just now with children in poverty, they're going to be raising children with the barest of means to be able to get by.
So you said it didn't kick in until 2018, or after the next federal election, so after the 2019 election. When you say kick in, like, is that the first time that money is going to be available? Because are they not able to apply for some things over the next year? I seem to remember hearing an interview about that.
My understanding is that the vast bulk of the money isn't coming online for another 2 years until after the election, but that I'm sure that there are some minor implementation points that are coming in advance of that.
And in fairness, $40 billion is a lot of money, so it does take some time to figure out how that is going to get spent.
Yeah. We've also got the City of Vancouver has got their housing strategy out now. The provincial government is promising to get a housing strategy out now that they're hard at work at it, and so it's really fascinating to see for the first time all arms of government really actually aggressively addressing housing as an issue.
And the criticism has been really interesting too. The criticism that the NDP gave at the federal level was not fast enough, do it now. The criticism from the Conservatives was there's nothing in here for people trying to get into the market. So basically, why didn't you put more money into this plan? And I thought it was really interesting to see that there was very little in terms of fiscal conservative critique of an enormous ask of the taxpayer. $40 billion is nothing to sneeze at. And there's it's interesting. I just think it's interesting that nobody's really said, well, this is too much to spend, or is this the right way of spending?
I think that really speaks to how serious everyone has perceived this problem to be.
Totally.
No one has a place to live in, and social housing is certainly a part of what the eventual solution is going to have to be. But some of those units that the provincial and municipal governments are going to build, it better be not social, but maybe the encouraging the development of low-cost rental.
Yep. Well, and I will say it was annoying to hear that from the Conservative Party because it continues this sort of obsession that the right seems to have with ownership of property. When in reality, I mean, I'd settle for just affordable rent. I'd love to own, sure, but it's pretty pie in the sky to say we just got to give people tools to buy when people can't even afford to rent.
Well, that's the American federal government's tactic. They put a lot of their housing dollars towards helping people get into home ownership because that's sort of their philosophy around building the middle class. And there are some arguments for that, but I think you're right. Like in Canada right now, in cities, it's pretty difficult to think about home ownership when you can barely afford rent.
We also don't save enough for retirement, so
there's a lot of problems that come before owning a home.
Yeah, but like I think what the Conservatives are alluding to is the practice of a lot of people to treat their home as their retirement fund.
Right.
And so they go into debt. We have the worst levels of household debt. And they will pay that off, but the value of the house increases so much that they're able to draw off the equity that they've accrued in their home so that they can finance their retirement.
And for good or for ill, a lot of Canadians depend on that. They're depending on home ownership. And if that's not going to be reality for our generation, you got to wonder what is going to replace home ownership as.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, we'll leave you with that.
I'm such a downer today.
I'm gonna worry about renting now versus retirement later. I think the now problems are now.
I'm sorry.
Well, we can always move on to something more lighthearted.
Yeah.
Okay. So we talked about a lot of important social issues. I'm sorry it's been a bit of a downer episode. I hope you've learned something. We're not going to leave you in this sad, somber place. We have an exciting, fun thing to talk about that was taking place on the Canadian Twitters this week. Matthew.
A acquaintance of the pod and friend of ours, Justin McElroy, who is the municipal affairs reporter for CBC Vancouver, has a website on which he embarks on little projects. He has been ranking his top 1,000 songs. He has been ranking every brewery and tasting room in Metro Vancouver.
Don't forget the Heritage Minutes.
Yes, the Heritage Minutes, and the Heritage Minutes will come up again in a couple. But he had a 64-place bracket.
NCAA style, which was explained to me because I didn't know what that meant.
Yeah, no, I didn't know what that meant either. Justin just said it as if it would mean something to me.
College sports.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
In America.
And also Burnaby.
Yes.
Suffice it to say, he had 64 of the greatest Canadian television shows that have ever been produced in English, and people have been voting over the last couple of weeks, eliminating them in a series of contests that led up to the final.
Also, numerous friendships destroyed.
Oh yes, and childhoods rend in twain.
How could Reboot beat Breaker High?
What? Of course Reboot bakes. Of course Reboot.
I'm a fan of both shows, don't get me wrong, but
Reboot
Breaker High is
better.
clearly the superior show.
When Bob went face to face with hexadecimal, his chances of survival shrank from small to infinitesimal.
I know how to win this argument with 2 words. Ryan Gosling.
I like his later work better, a little personally.
Blade Runner was pretty great, I have to admit.
But Reboot went down. That was a tragedy. But it went up against the eventual winner of the contest, which in the final round, Kids in the Hall, everyone's childhood favorite, Mr. Dress Up, Bernie Coombs.
I'm sorry, I don't actually have anything to say here.
I would say, what a run for SCTV, though.
Yeah.
Or, sorry, SCTV. No, not SCTV. Kids in the Hall. What a run for Kids in the Hall. They managed to take out Trailer Park Boys and SCTV on their way to near victory.
Yeah, I was surprised, actually, that SCTV didn't win the comedy bracket. So.
And so many fun things, like getting to explain to people who Wayne and Schuster were.
Did you, or do you, have a tickle trunk?
Yes, I've had, I think, 2 throughout my lifetime. They haven't been ever painted in the red and flower print that the original was, but it was the thing in which I kept my costumes.
There you go. We have several tickle trunks, because being good hipsters, we go to regular costumes.
It's important. For our non-Canadian listeners, a tickle trunk is just a box where you keep your costumes, and this term was coined by Mr. Dress Up because that's what he did. He had a great big box full of amazing costumes, and he put them on, and it was great fun. Hung out with his puppets and drew things, and it was just a magical half hour that all of us got to enjoy between graham crackers and apple juice in our early years. And it's funny, like when I go to visit my friends across Canada, they all have a tickle trunk still in their adult years. It's not necessarily a trunk, it might just be a Ziploc bag, but it's got costumey things in it.
And it is referred to as the tickle trunk.
Exactly, yep. Yeah. So I can see how Mr. Dress Up won, especially amongst those who use Twitter.
Well, and Canadian political Twitter was all abuzz about it. Gerald Butts, the chief of staff to the Prime Minister, even tried to fight for his preferred show, Traitors, to somehow beat Degrassi, which, by the way...
there was scandalous.
Which, by the way, the fact that Gerald Butts' favorite show is Traitors says a lot about him. I also enjoyed that show, but I wouldn't call it my favorite. But yes, it was absolutely fantastic to watch that happen. There were tens of thousands of votes cast. It was really neat.
Very neat. So, nice work, Justin. I'm sure we are going to be debating about the best Canadian TV thing over everybody's holiday meals for the next few weeks.
Reboot was robbed!
Okay, I think we've had enough social issues and politics for one episode.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
What have you guys been thinking about this week?
Every November, December, I get really excited in a weird way about king tides, which is the sun and the moon aligned in some kind of a weird way that results in significantly higher tidal activity than usual. And so the high tide becomes significantly higher tide than normal, which is a vision of our climate change future. And so I go out and I usually take photos of it. And this year, the city of Vancouver, vancouver.ca/king tides, has a website that you can upload your photos to. It's really neat. You can see all sorts of, the seawall will flood in various places. They'll usually set up sandbanks to try to block flooding from damaging homes and stuff like that. It's a really fascinating thing. It's December 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, all in the morning. So if you're on the seawall on December 5th at 7:30 in the morning, you'll be able to get a bit of a neat show of some water washing up over the banks of the seawall.
So I'm going to try and beat your nerdery over king tides because I am so excited this week about the release of the census data around commute mode share.
Yes.
I am so stoked about
I have been reading so much of it.
I know. So of course the 2016 census has been released in waves over the last year, and they just released the commute data, which is where everybody tells Stats Canada about how they get to work and how long it takes them, and do they bike or do they drive. And as a transportation planner, this is like getting your report card and finding out that we're doing better. We have more people taking transit across the country. We have more people cycling and walking, and commute times in Vancouver actually went down. Things are great. I'm really excited. Let's keep up the good work, Canada.
Christmas party season is upon us, and so I, like many Canadians, appreciate the Christmas party season, dating back all the way to, Lady Jane Simcoe Grey, who hated the summer because it was a time of toil, but loved the winter for it was a time of balls and cards. And my first...
Sorry, I'm a 12-year-old.
Yes, all right. Have your laugh. Have your laugh, children.
Sorry, my inner 12-year-old's coming out.
I'm going to my first winter ball this coming Saturday at my dear friend Isabel and Ricardo's. Ricardo has a beer that he entered a homebrewing competition.
I haven't had that yet.
There is going to be a keg of this. It is a beer that my friend Ricardo entered into a homebrewing competition. Lupolo, one of the new breweries in Vancouver, unranked on the Justin McElroy ranking system because it wasn't open early enough, decided that they were going to make it. It is a limoncello Radler, I think.
I think so. It sounds really delicious.
And I'm sure it's going to be great, and I'm really looking forward to trying it. So that's what I've been thinking about every day.
Every day. Okay, that's it for us on Pod Keep Our Land for this week. We put out new podcasts every 2 weeks. You can find out about us on our website. We have a Facebook group. We have a Twitter. Follow us. Leave us comments. Send us emails.
Rate and review us on iTunes.
And please review us on iTunes. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Erin Rennie.
I'm Matthew Naylor.
And I'm Patrick Meehan.
We'll talk to you next time on Pod Keep Our Land.
Sweet.